Hello, good morning and welcome. It's Tuesday, September the 9th, the day Kemi Badenoch tries to get noticed amid the din. My name is Sam Coates of Sky News.
And I'm Anne McElvoy from Politico. Everyone's getting to grips with a new look government with a refreshed cabinet meeting this morning, and Labour MPs have just 48 hours to declare for the deputy leadership race. Might that include Bridget Phillipson? There's a lot going on. Welcome to Politics at Sam and Anne's, the podcast that gives you everything you need to know about the day ahead in British politics and some of what might follow from that.
So we need to start, however, with some breaking news that developed overnight. Files from the estate of the deceased billionaire paedophile Jeffrey Epstein have been handed over to a congressional committee, and files from a birthday book compiled for the sex trafficker appear to include a glowing contribution from our man in Washington, Peter Mandelson.
Yes, documents appear to show Lord Mandelson calling Epstein his best pal and writing of his friend taking you by surprise in one of his glorious homes he likes to share with his friends. Yum, yum. Close quotes.
You can see on the Sky News website and elsewhere the extended messages. We have to say this, Sky News has contacted the British Embassy in Washington to comment and was referred to Peter Mandelson's previous statement. In the past, Lord Mandelson has said, "I'm not answering any questions about Jeffrey Epstein. My knowledge of him is something I regret. I wish I'd never met him in the first place." And we've also asked about his association with Epstein while he was in jail. And Lord Mandelson replied in the past, "Why did many people meet him? He was a prolific networker, and I wish I'd never met him in the first place." Let's see how that story develops at a sensitive time.
Well, Lord Mandelson has been at the forefront of planning for next week's state visit, of course, when Donald Trump comes to the UK, but a lot of the preparations have been taking place in the embassy in Washington as well. The US president will be meeting the King and holding talks at Chequers. Now, the collection of these birthday tributes, including a hand drawing of a woman's body signed Donald, which is part of a long and ongoing controversy about whether Donald Trump gave something of this nature to Jeffrey Epstein. These files contain a picture of Epstein holding an outsized check signed by DJ Trump. The connection is clearly still a shadow over so many people. And the short answer, Sam, to the Peter Mandelson question, why did so many people meet him, is that so many other powerful people met him and they made it their business to know him. And even before the full horrors of the Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell network of sex trafficking and abuse of young women came to light, in a quite cynical New York way, I would suggest that Donald Trump would have been more surprised if Peter Mandelson hadn't known Epstein than anything else, because as much as people don't like to talk about it now, so many of the people that I spoke to from that set, that sort of high-ranking business New York to London and vice versa set, knew both Ghislaine Maxwell and Jeffrey Epstein, and that just came to light when I was making a film about her.
Gosh, the shadow of all of that cast is a very long one. Right, the timing of that couldn't be more difficult. But let's get to matters more pressing today. It's Tuesday, so we've got lots of polling and actually some exclusive polling from YouGov for this podcast. But I'll start with the headline voting intention that they do for Sky News and The Times, which in itself is interesting. So now, if you remember, all our weekly polling they conduct the polling on Sunday and Monday. And so a lot's happened since last week's headline poll, because not only was there the Reform UK conference, but there was the sacking of Angela Rayner and the complete refresh of the government. So this is the first indicator of public opinion since any of that happened. And actually, the numbers have just come down a bit for Reform UK. They're now down to on 27%, despite all the publicity for their conference. Labour are up to on 22%. Tories unchanged on 17%. Lib Dems on 15%. Greens on 12%. So all of that chaos in government and all of that publicity for Nigel Farage don't seem to have had what you might think of as some of the more traditional polling effects. So it'll be interesting to see how that spins out over time. I've also got the latest favourability figures just for this podcast that tell their own story. And it's a story of the public really not being impressed with almost anybody in British politics. What you see, and these are net favourability figures, which means that you take the proportion that say that they see somebody favourably, and you minus the proportion that say that they see them unfavourably, and that gives you this figure. All the numbers are in the negatives, right, in British politics, but some are more negative than others. And Keir Starmer is on minus 46. Then the two of his main rivals for the job, Kemi Badenoch and Nigel Farage, well, they're both on negative territory, and they both do a bit better, but not a step change better. So Kemi's on minus 39, Nigel's on minus 35. Then look at this, kind of arguably the biggest, most popular mainstream leader is the Liberal Democrat leader, Ed Davey, who is on minus 8, and Zach Polansky, the new Green leader who was elected last week. He's really not very well known. 2/3 of the population haven't heard of him, but amongst those that do, his rating is pretty similar to Ed Davey on minus 10. So there you go. And what do you make of all of that slew of numbers?
I can't help thinking of that old song. You've got to accentuate the negative and eliminate the positive to invert that. It's fascinating, isn't it? That the main thing that comes through for me there is that overall sense of negativity towards characters from the electorate. And you're right, if you're Ed Davey, you're probably quite happy or very happy to be only on minus 8. But looking at the main parties, yes, Reform are down 2 points. So the Reform conference, the razzmatazz that we covered on this podcast and elsewhere, doesn't seem to have made a great leap forward there for Nigel Farage and co. At the same time, Sam, we're sitting here in the morning talking about Reform being down to 27%. Let's keep that in proportion. These are still extraordinarily confident figures for an insurgent party, and Labour, as you say, edging up a bit, somewhat mysteriously. But hey, that's the polling for you. And I'm also struck by the fact that can be going on. Maybe people got this idea of a new start or a fresh start after a lot of trouble for Labour, when Keir Starmer's personal polling is so weak in the minus 40s. It does bring us back to the question. I know one can't, if you try to run your political discussions by the latest state of the polls, you'd end up skewing quite a lot, wouldn't you, a long way out from an election. But I think it does bring you back to a question we touched on yesterday, which is, what is the effect of everything that is going on Keir Starmer in Labour? And how does he intend to rebuild his personal brand while we're all talking about who's Buggin's turn, who's got this new job, who's going to be deputy leader, etc.? What is happening to the Prime in Prime Minister?
I'm going to feel a bit silly about saying this. That there are conversations that I'm starting to have quite a lot in Westminster, and you tend not to relay what I'm about to say just because it feels quite too soon, not quite bad enough. But the number of conversations that you now have about whether or not Keir Starmer is going to remain in post next summer, if the local elections, the Scottish elections, the Welsh elections are as bad as the polling suggests that the party is on course to be, are just quite noticeable. You can normally dismiss the odd MP speculating loosely about their leader's future because it's not totally uncommon, but it is now a regular pattern. The blame inside Westminster is attaching itself to Keir Starmer, just as the public opinion is blaming him. We're not in a good place because MPs can sniff a vulnerability of a leader, which will then have a sort of ripple effect through his political authority. So good luck, Johnny Reynolds, the new chief whip. I was talking to one person who was at last night's Parliamentary Labour Party, and there's a sort of slightly tweaked political attack line from Keir Starmer that tries to take in some of the criticism that he's only dealing with reform. He's now facing both ways. He started using this language about the Greens being plastic progressives, just as reform are plastic patriots. In other words, you can vote for reform or you could vote for the Greens. You won't really get what they say on the tin, a sort of a more patriotic government or a more green and sort of left-wing government, because they promise something that they can't deliver. So Keir Starmer explicitly moving and facing two ways when attacking his enemies. Noticeably, he talks almost not at all about the Tories. So just because I want to give her some airtime out of fairness and because it's interesting, it is the job of the Tory leader right now to attract attention. And that's what she's attempting to do today.
Today, Kemi Badenoch will give a speech where she will make an offer to work with the government to cut the welfare bill. She suggests that the Prime Minister, the Chancellor, and the new Welfare Secretary, that's Pat McFadden, should meet with her. Mel Stride and Helen Whately will also be meeting to agree a plan to cut welfare spending of their own. But just a small detail that caught my eye on that, Sam, is that Helen Whately sent a very nice message on social media regretting that Liz Kendall had been moved out of that role for Labour in the reshuffle, quite generously saying that she knew she had seriously tried to reform welfare. Well, it turns out there was a bit of an undertone to that. It was prep for the Tories saying, well, clearly this is chaos and we want to get onto the pitch of welfare reformers as well. Kemi Badenoch will recommit to the two-child benefit cap, and she will warn Labour that Britain is being pushed closer to a bond crisis. We might have a word about that in a minute, as it's one of my favourite topics. And that the deficit is set to double down over the next 5 years. So I think what we're seeing there, Sam, is Kemi Badenoch much more actively shadowing the government on real-time issues and trying to get herself into that conversation by offering to be part of it. Don't expect a very quick thank you there from the government.
And you can see why on the timing, the Pat McFadden media operation proactively sent out a message yesterday with some comments from the new Work and Pension Secretary saying that the new Secretary of State was deeply concerned by the number of young people not in work. And so they're signaling that they want to get on with another attempt at reform. And, pretty much on day one in the job, you had Shabana Mahmood do her reset and Pat McFadden's doing his. So there is method in that timing madness. Kemi Badenoch did try and set conditions for Liz Kendall for Tory support. The Labour position didn't meet those conditions, so the Tories didn't support it. The Tories are rerunning that argument, but louder. But in fact, she's going further this time, and she is hitting what the Treasury are desperately trying to turn into a taboo in British politics, but bluntly right now are failing. Because Kemi Badenoch was out and about last night on the BBC saying she was really worried that the UK might be forced to embark on a 1976-style bailout from the IMF. The Conservative leader was saying that the UK could have to go, and we've talked about this phrase before, cap in hand to the IMF unless it delivers a plan for economic growth. I know just how touchy the Treasury are when anybody, including kind of economic journalists, raise the subject of the IMF only to knock them down again. Even then, the Treasury, I think, hate it. And now the Tory leader has come crashing into this debate or inserting herself in this debate, depending on how you see it. She says that there are well-respected economic commentators. An economist says this. And what do you make of it? Is it sensible politics, or is it talking Britain down, or is it opportunism that she shouldn't do? I don't really know what to make of it. What do you think?
I think it's interesting already in one way, an internal Conservative politics about this, and we don't hear this from the Shadow Chancellor Mel Stride, who doesn't really go sort of flamming up the IMF line as much as Kemi Badenoch. And I think that tells you he might now, now that she's gone out there. But it's not really the way that he looks at Britain's economic problems. I think that there is a view that we could be heading for some kind of very adverse economic event, but we wouldn't be the only country in that position. And more likely than not, it might be led by something that kicks off in the US. And that has always been, if you like, the sort of, if there's going to be a disaster, let's be ready to pounce. That has been pretty much the Stride Badenoch position. Now Kemi Badenoch has gone further and she's picked up this idea of prospective or possible IMF bailouts again. What I read into it, Sam, is that if there is a crisis mood around, and if you're the opposition, and if things haven't been going so well, why not lean into it? Why not just get in on the drama? The difficulty with that is it's not so much the talking Britain down line, because if you took, that's always said, if you say anything negative, it's not a very strong argument. But it's this, it's how credible is it? And if one of the problems that you have as the opposition is sometimes that you're not seen to be credible in terms of some sort of economic thinking or alternative, is this really going to help you or not? You'll certainly get some headlines, and maybe that is really is the intention. And look, if anyone was going to go cap in hand, or rather chapeau bas, to the IMF right now, it would be France, where yesterday the fifth Prime Minister, Michel Bayou, has resigned and is talking about, quotes, life-threatening debt at 114% of GDP in France, and we're at about 96%, which is pretty bad, but it's certainly not where France is. And I think what Kemi Badenoch is doing is attaching a kind of crisis narrative to broader economic performance. And given so much adversity in the economy, I think that's not surprising. But you still come back to the things. A lot of people get in touch with me after the podcast when we do the IMF chat that we seem to now do most weeks. But we don't have a currency crisis of the kind that we had in 76. We don't have a current account deficit of the kind that we had in 76 after the Barber boom and its collapse and the run on the pound in quite specific circumstances. And by the way, it wasn't the solution in 1976 either. Only a portion of the loan was ever called on. And Dennis Healy then described getting rid of it as sod-off day in the days when politicians spoke so directly. But what it is a metaphor for underperformance and a kind of perma-angst. So that's what I think is really going on here.
Look, I think I hear you, Anne, and I think that's a very important set of reminders about political history, British history, and economic reality. And I'm going to pause that subject there because we've got the last couple of minutes of the podcast for the deputy leadership race for Labour. And I'm going to be really boring about this again. I know a lot of people are obsessing about this race, but it is not the most important thing that's going on because it is an indicator of the mood of the internal Labour Party politics. It won't be decisive, I think, in the future of the Prime Minister. And also, it is a race for a cut down job that probably doesn't have any role in government. And I'm struggling to see that it is a defining element of the Labour Party politics. Lots of people disagree with me, but that's my take. But we will cover it on this podcast. I just don't think it is as important as some of the coverage suggests. Nominations are now open, and the first stage means candidates must get 80 nominations before Thursday, which is an incredibly high number. It's basically designed to lock out not only the hard left, but probably a lot of the soft left too. We've got one confirmed candidate in the form of the left-winger Belle Ribeiro Addy, who used to work for Diane Abbott, but it's hard to see her getting on the ballot paper, even though she's now got Richard Bergen's support. That is still, there are not enough Socialist Campaign Group MPs to deliver that. She's having a blast at the undemocratic contest. Really, today, we're seeing whether Bridget Phillipson, the Education Secretary, might tiptoe forward. She's before the TUC. Notably, her team have been blanking me and other journalists when we've been asking if she isn't a sort of slightly leadership preferred candidate, maybe somebody like Alison McGovern, who was a welfare minister, who's a sort of loyalist, former chair of Progress, who's on the right of the party. How is this going to progress, Anne? And is it really a good idea for Keir Starmer to have somebody from his government as the deputy leader of the party as well?
You would say in any organizational way, why not, right? Why would you take them from somewhere else? Because you'd just be importing some kind of a different kind of power center, however minor, into the debate. But it depends, doesn't it, whether the Keir Morgan McSweeney machine fundamentally accepts that you need some sort of ventilation function in this role for the way that the party is feeling, someone who is not just going to be plowing through the lines to take from number 10. That is always the danger, isn't it? That if you centralize too much, you then end up with so many people in the Labour Party feeling that nobody is able to assuage their doubts or look after their sensitivity. So that might be one consideration here. And then you can see why someone like Bridget Phillipson, who seems to be blanking us all, hello, morning, Bridget, on her intentions, yes, in the government, but has absolutely, got a support base in the northeast, and also in her tone would perhaps be seen as perhaps more attractive than others around Keir Starmer to some party members. So you could imagine that. You could also imagine going for someone like Alison McGovern, who is a strong media performer, sort of slightly mushy middle in the politics, but not seen as perhaps too close to the leadership. And then there's always the ocean-going Emily Thornberry, isn't there? But I suspect that might get as many anti-votes as pro, but could be wrong about that. You could look at people like Lucy Powell, but if you've just been kicked out as leader of the Commons, perhaps you're not in the mood to go up for an internal party election. I think your point is very interesting. Does it matter at all? Probably not as much as a lot of the media, political media, are saying. But having a contest, any contest, is always a pea shooter, isn't it? It gives us people to talk about and positions to compare. To that extent, I do think it's an inconvenience to Keir Starmer.
I couldn't agree more. So keep your eyes peeled. We should get a public tally at the end of today about how people are doing. So that'll be quite interesting to see. I do just wonder, given the currents of this contest, whether having somebody who takes the government whip won't end up just having to resign it if they do come from government, because you're going to be elected probably on a tide of votes of people who are not terribly impressed by Keir Starmer, and that'll put you on a clash with the government line. So that's just one thought about why it might be inconvenient. Anyway, all of that is speculation, and we are out of time. So thank you very much indeed, Anne. Let's see where it all goes tomorrow, and we will give you an update to the deputy leadership race, but maybe just not as breathlessly as everybody else in 24 hours. We will see you tomorrow.
See you then.